Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us. Do let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from. Oh, we have Dubai, Belgium, already all around. Orlando, Florida, my gosh. Aberdeen, Italy. Wow, we really are all over. That's fantastic. So I'll get started. Welcome, firstly, everybody, to this What is Orange Wine webinar. My name's Anjali, and just so you know, this session is going to be recorded and will be available to watch via the WSET Global Events Hub on YouTube. If you do have any questions, please do place them in the Q&A box, because that's the box I'll be checking, and I will take some questions at the end of this session. So do use that Q&A function. Okay, so just as a hello, really, and an introduction of myself, my name's Anjali. I am a wine educator at the WSET School in London, where I teach WSET courses in wine level 1, 2, and recently qualified to teach level 3 courses as well. Now, orange wine, it's a topic that's sort of seemingly suddenly become kind of everywhere. It's popping up all over in shops, on restaurant lists. I'm hearing about it more and more. I'm getting more and more questions about it. So I think it's a really kind of timely topic, and really a lot to dig into. So we won't really even, I imagine, probably manage to scratch the surface in the kind of 20-25 minutes we have, but I'm going to do my best. And the first thing I think might be the most useful is to do a little bit of myth busting. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at some key kind of myths that surround the category of orange wine and dispel them. And then we're going to have a little look at what orange wine is, a few recommendations, a few food pairings and things like that, which hopefully, if any of you have tasted some orange wines recently, can help out with recommendations with those wines with some food. That would be fab. So firstly, my first myth is a bit of an annoying one, really. Orange wines look orange in colour. It's not necessarily as simple as that, which I hope I will be able to show you by my use of the humble Venn diagram. So orange wine can sometimes look orange, or probably a better term is amber in appearance, but not always. Orange wines really can be quite a wide spectrum of appearances, including a kind of lemon yellow, a more golden appearance, amber, bright orange. Even some orange wines can be pink in colour. So we can expect a whole array of different appearances within this category of orange wines. We'll have a look at that in a bit more detail when we look at the production process. Now, my second myth, orange wine is made from oranges. Quite a common misconception, actually. And I'm going to bring back my Venn diagram here. And as you can see, orange wine is not really connected to oranges. In fact, when I'm talking about orange wine in this webinar, I'm not talking about the fruit oranges involved at any stage in the production process. However, I really wanted to rack my brains with this, and have found a couple of exceptions, which you're welcome to kind of take into account. I don't think they will affect how we are going to look at this style of wine, but they're just a couple of things to kind of keep in mind. Firstly, the mimosa, a truly wonderful cocktail made up of sparkling wine and orange juice. So there is potentially a connection here. This is wine that has orange juice in it, but it is not what we would term as orange wine, as delicious as it is, known as Bucks Fizz in the UK. And the second, I mean, in the wine world, there really does end up being an exception to everything. So another exception I have dug out for you is Vino de Naranja from Huelva and Malaga in Spain. And this is what we call an aromatized wine. So it behaves a little bit like a vermouth. And it's a wine that has had orange peel macerated into it to impart some flavour. I haven't actually tasted it myself, but in my kind of research for this presentation, it is up there on my list as a style I'd really like to taste. But really, when it comes to this webinar and when you're sort of hearing about orange wine out and about, we won't be kind of referring to these. We'll be referring to something entirely different, a wine made from grapes. Okay, myth number 3. Orange wine is natural wine. Now, this is also a little bit of a tricky one, but some orange wine is natural, and not all natural wine is orange wine. Really, there is and can be quite a big crossover here, but natural wine is a philosophy and a perspective of how one might want to make wine and approach winemaking, whereas orange wine is a category or style of wine that any winemaker can produce. So there is quite a lot of crossover here, and that's because orange wine lends itself very well to making as few interventions as possible whilst making wine. And so they kind of complement each other very well, but that's not to say that all orange wine is by definition going to be natural, and certainly not the other way around. Okay, my final myth to bust is that orange wines are just a trend, that they're a passing trend, and soon they'll be kind of entirely forgotten about. And it really couldn't be kind of further from the truth here. I've managed to dig out a painting. Please excuse me because I'm not an art historian, but this is a painting by Hans von Aachen, a German painter born in 1552. And I am pretty sure here that he is drinking a glass of orange wine. And in fact, if you look at lots of paintings, if you go to, for example, the National Gallery, somewhere like that, and you see wine being depicted in beautiful kind of paintings and portraits, it almost always looks like it might be orange wine. And actually, the truth is, orange wines, they predate white wines. So when it comes to white wine making, we'll look at this in a little bit more detail shortly, but white wine making requires more equipment and kind of technological development, let's say, than the production of orange wine. So orange wine predates the category of white wine. Countries like Georgia have been making orange wine for 8,000 years. So it's certainly, in that sense, not a passing trend. Production has more or less continued around the world in various different parts of the world for an incredibly long time. There's evidence of this style of wine being produced in ancient Egypt as well. And moving kind of closer to the present day, it has been kind of as recently as the 60s that these wines were, I've put here just as widely consumed, but maybe not just as widely, but still pretty widely consumed. Certainly parts of northern, northeastern Italy, parts of Slovenia, that these wines were really, really commonly consumed. So it may be more accurate to say that we're coming out of the trend of not drinking very much orange wine. And a big resurgence of this style, in the West at least, began approximately 20 years ago. And most credit winemaker Josko Gravner with that, who's based in Friuli in northeastern Italy. So you can buy Gravner wines today, and they're certainly worth tasting if you want to kind of geek out on this category. So these are my 4 myths, which hopefully I've made a start at busting, but as we go through the rest of this presentation, we can dig in a little bit to some of these ideas. And please do, as I said, I can see already a couple of questions popping up. Please do ask some questions, which I'll come to at the end. Now, we've looked at what orange wine isn't, but what is orange wine? I've had a go at writing a definition here. Orange wine, firstly, is wine that is made using white grape varieties. So it needs to be made using white grape varieties. You'll hopefully have heard of quite a few of these, including Chardonnay is a white grape variety, Sauvignon Blanc, Chenin Blanc, Pinot Grigio. So we need to be using white grape varieties. And the skins of these grapes for the production of orange wine have been left in contact with the juice during fermentation. So we're going to soak those skins in the rest of the grape juice whilst fermentation is taking place. And the effect that this will have is we will impart flavour. We will also very often be imparting tannin and imparting colour. Tannin is that drying sensation that you can pick up when you're tasting red wines. You also find tannins in tea, so they kind of dry out your mouth a little bit, and they exist on the skins of our grapes. So white wine, we generally don't find that drying sensation. Red wine, we generally do, and orange wine, we will also likely find this kind of drying sensation from tannins. We'll pick up some colour as well. As I said earlier, we might be picking up a kind of orangey colour, as you can see in this image on the side, but it may be closer to a kind of lemony yellow, it may be more golden, and that really depends on how the winemaker is going to approach making the wine. And on that note, I think it's worth looking at how these wines are made, the kind of sequence of what needs to take place in order to make orange wine. And in order to do that, I think it's probably best to start with how we make white wine. And so I'm going to show you a slide here, which I've pretty much nicked from the WSET level 2 qualification in wine. There's something similar that you can find in your level 1 courses as well. And when we're making white wine, firstly, we want to harvest our grapes and we want to crush up those grapes to release the juice inside those grapes. And then what we pretty much immediately want to do is press those crushed up grapes. And so you can see that in the kind of second image under pressing, these grapes are being pushed through a vessel that has lots and lots of holes at the bottom and has a big heavy plate on the top that will push down all of these crushed up grapes, and that will just release the pure, clear grape juice that exists in the kind of pulp inside the grapes. And all of the solids, the skins and the seeds, any stems that have got in there, will kind of stay at the top of this press as a kind of cake of solids, really. And so when it comes to making white wine, all we want to be fermenting is pure, clear grape juice. So we've released all of that clear juice from the press. We will allow fermentation to take place. And that means adding a little bit of yeast. That yeast will then consume the sugar in that grape juice and convert it into alcohol. And then, hey presto, we have our wine. We have our white wine. We can then choose to store it or mature it for a period of time, and then we package it. But really, I think the most important thing to take away when it comes to the production of white wine is that the grape skins don't play any part in the style, the texture, the aromas and flavors that you're going to get in that wine. Those skins are essentially kind of a byproduct of production. We can get rid of them, we can feed them to pigs, we can make grape out of them, but we're not going to use them for the production of our white wine. So with that in mind, I'm going to now show you how orange wine is made. And really, it just means a few parts in this process, the sequencing is flipped a little bit. So when we're making orange wine, we are going to still harvest our white grape varieties. They need to be white grape varieties here. We're going to crush them up. And then what we're going to do is we're going to allow all of those crushed up grapes, the pulp, the skins, the seeds, to ferment. And what that means is, whilst alcoholic fermentation is taking place, so by that I mean whilst the yeast is seeking out the sugar and converting it into alcohol, what is also taking place is those grape skins are soaking in that liquid and imparting maybe a little bit of their tannin, that mouth drying quality, and maybe a little bit of colour as well. And you can leave these grapes, when it comes to the production of orange wine, in contact with that juice for anything between about a week and about a year. And this plays a big part in the final appearance of the wine. So the longer we leave those grapes, those grape skins in contact with that liquid, the more of that colour we're going to be extracting out of our grapes. And potentially more importantly, the more tannin we're also going to be extracting. So the more kind of drying and kind of textural that wine is then going to be. This is a really kind of wide amount of time, anytime from a week to a year, and that will really determine the final style that we're likely to expect in our orange wine. So we've crushed up our grapes, we've allowed alcoholic fermentation to take place with the skins in contact with the rest of the juice. And when we're happy that the skins have done their job and have imparted everything we need in terms of flavours, texture, that tannin, we'll then press. So we'll then take all of that liquid, including all of the seeds and the skins, and we'll put that through our press. And we will just release, at this point, the orange wine. Then we have the option to store or mature that wine, and then we can package it. We have options here, so we can put it in an oak barrel if we want. We could keep it in stainless steel. What is increasingly done with orange wine is put it in clay vessels, potentially things like amphora, and then we can package that wine, and we're ready. So if I just quickly flip back to our white wine production, you can see that all that really changes is step 2 and step 3 are flipped. So there we go. If I just go back, that's our white wine. We press earlier on in the process. And for our orange wine, we press a little bit later. Now, if we were using this orange wine process, but we were instead harvesting black grape varieties, we'd be making red wine. So we'd be harvesting our black grapes and allowing those black grapes to soak in the juice, imparting this deep red colour and their tannin too. So it's quite helpful, I suppose, to think of an orange wine as a white wine made in the same way as a red wine, or using white grape varieties, sorry, I should say, and processing those in the same way that you would for a red wine. Or what's a term quite commonly used is a skin contact white wine. Might be another way that you term an orange wine. And by that we mean those grape skins are left in contact with the liquid. I do think orange can be a little bit misleading, partly because it's so connected to the fruit, oranges, partly because it is quite well connected to the colour, which is not always going to be orange. So skin contact can be quite useful, I think. There's lots of winemakers who prefer the term amber as well, so as not to confuse the wine with the fruit oranges. And so we've made our orange wine, but what does it taste like? And I think that's one of the really truly wonderful things about orange wine, is that there is such a wide set of aromas and flavours that you can find. And I've just got a few of them down here, but there really are so many more. Orange wine can be particularly floral, all different kinds of flowers as well, so from kind of honeysuckle, roses, many different flowers, and including dried flowers as well. So they can be very kind of floral and perfumed. They can share lots in common with aromas of tea, and different styles of tea as well. So black tea, green tea, chamomile, you also find aromas of those teas in orange wines. And that goes along quite well with the texture that you can often find in orange wines, this kind of grip from those grape skins imparting their tannin. So you can find these lovely aromas of tea, of flowers, and then also of dried fruit. So here I've got dried apricot, which is quite a common aroma in lots of orange wines, but all sorts of other dried fruits as well. Things like dried apple, dried pineapple, even kind of baked apple aroma you can often find in orange wines. So this really also only just scratches the surface. On top of these aromas, things like flowers, tea and dried fruit, we can also find all of the aromas that you might find in whites, maybe a bit more supercharged, a little bit more intense. So lots of citrus fruit, citrus peel, fresh fruit as well. Lots of tropical fruit aromas you can particularly find in orange wines, and then other kinds of herbs and spices. So orange wines can often exhibit aromas of things like saffron, all those kind of more aromatic spices, coriander seed and fennel, and aromas like that. So there's often a real lot going on aromatically in an orange wine. I think that's just one reason to really get stuck in, try and find some and taste them, because some of the aromas you can detect in orange wines, you really can't find in whites, reds or rosés. So what to try? I've got a few suggestions here, including some regions, some grape varieties and some styles. So firstly, in lots of ways, the home of orange wine is wines from Georgia. And these will be termed amber wines. They're becoming increasingly easy to find. They're becoming more and more popular. And what is quite popular at the moment when it comes to Georgian wine is Qvevri wines, which you can see these vessels in this image on the side, and this is a really traditional way to produce wine in Georgia, and some of those wines are amber wines. And so the grapes are placed, the crushed up grapes are placed in these Qvevri vessels, which are often, not always, dug underground to keep temperatures really nice and cool and constant, and then lifted back out of the ground when they're ready. And this can be like a year later, where they've imparted some colour and some tannin into those wines. So they're really, really worth tasting and seeking out. In terms of some other key regions, the kind of home of orange wine is the winemaking regions of Slovenia, and also close to the Slovenian border, the region of Friuli Venezia Giulia in Italy. So this is really where you're going to find producers who have been making orange wine for longer. Potentially, I mentioned earlier, Josko Gravner is kind of credited with the resurgence, at least in Europe, of this style. And Gravner wines are based in Friuli, so worth checking out for the kind of the OGs, or at least the new OGs. Ramato wine. This is a style of wine made in Friuli. So you'll see both written on the label. Ramato wine is a wine, an orange wine made using Pinot Grigio grapes. And you'll see this amber golden colour. And again, a more kind of traditional style of that production. So worth seeking those out. You'll see the term Ramato on the label. A little bit of a controversial one. Tokai, more well known, I suppose, and not necessarily considered an orange wine. But if we go back to the way that orange wine is produced via skin contact of white grape varieties, soaking in the juice, that is how Tokai Asu is made. We will take our asu berries, so berries inflicted by noble rot. So by this point, they're a little bit shriveled, but we're going to macerate those berries back into our grape juice. And so what is that if not orange wine? I don't think it generally comes under that category if you were looking at a wine list or if you were in a store, but I think it's worth kind of remembering that not all orange wine is necessarily what we think. It's all about how we're making it in the first place, and I suppose in some senses Tokai can come under that bracket. Some grape varieties that are well known for producing some high quality orange wines. Ribolla Gialla, this again we find in northeastern Italy, famous for the production of orange wine. Zebibo is responsible for making some high quality orange wines in Sicily. It's a Muscat grape, so you may know it by another name. Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc, also well known for orange wine, and then Chenin Blanc is increasingly being used for the production of orange wine. So hopefully some of these grape varieties you've heard of, and maybe some of them are something a little bit new for you to kind of explore and try. Because orange wine really is a production process, we can make orange wine using a really wide variety of grape varieties. So this again really just scratches the surface. We can make orange wine using all sorts of different varietals. Aromatic grape varieties are becoming increasingly popular ways to make orange wine because they've already got quite a lot of kind of intense floral or herbaceous character. So look out for more orange wines made using aromatic varietals, things like Gewürztraminer, potentially Sauvignon Blanc. Lastly, before we kind of have a little look at some questions, I can see that they're adding up in my Q&A board. Some food pairing. Now, I think one of the most fantastic things about orange wine is just how versatile it is with food. So again, I am only scratching the surface here. There is an awful lot of food that will go incredibly well with orange wine. It's sort of one of the reasons that I would really encourage you to seek it out and try it, is not necessarily to consume by itself, though that's an interesting thing, but to have alongside food. I think that's really where lots of orange wine can sing. That texture that is picked up from those grape skins really lends itself well to lots of different foods. And so just a few ideas here. Lebanese food. You can see with my first two suggestions, Lebanese food and Indian food, these are very kind of diverse food groups. And that's partly where I'm going with this, is that it is quite versatile orange wine and can go with lots of different flavors and can kind of live up to lots of different powerful flavors in foods, which actually a lot of wines can end up struggling and getting a little bit lost with really powerful, intense flavors in food. So Lebanese food, think lots of acidity in things like pickles, as well as some kind of creaminess from yogurts, some kind of rich fried foods as well, so things like falafel, and then grilled meats as well can go, especially if they've been kind of seasoned with different spices and herbs, can go really well with lots of orange wines. Indian foods, I try to sort of place this as a good food pairing for lots of different wines because I am half Indian and I think Indian food goes well with all sorts of different wines, but very much so with orange wines. I think those slightly kind of spicy aromatics you can often find in orange wine really go well with lots of the kind of delicate aromatic spicing that you find in all sorts of Indian food. And again, the diversity of Indian food, I've got a picture of it, well, really it looks like a thali here, means that an orange wine is more likely to be happy alongside all of these different flavors. So definitely give that a go. And lastly, mature, strong, hard cheeses can be a really lovely pairing, as well as lots of different nuts. Walnut does get a bit more of a shout out. In my research, walnut is often seen as a kind of really lovely nut to go with these orange wines, but all sorts of nuts I think would be lovely. As we're, am I allowed to say we're almost approaching Christmas? I don't think so. We're only just in October here. But as we're getting more of this stuff on the table, I think it's worth experimenting a little bit more with some orange wines alongside things like cheese boards, especially if you've got either slightly nuttier cheeses or bowls of nuts. Certainly worth giving a go. So that's my kind of whistle-stop tour of orange wine. And I can see we've got some questions. So I'm just going to have a little look at some questions now. I've got some suggestions for orange wine. Cortem in Portugal do an orange wine. That sounds lovely. I'm seeing increasing amounts of orange wine coming out of Portugal, so that's exciting. Orange wine and food. Well, here, Ed, I've just scratched the surface, but I think it's really one to experiment with. And there are way fewer ways to go wrong when it comes to orange wine and food pairing. So I think that's a it's a particularly good one to experiment with, I would say. Can the barrel wood used to change the colour? Clive, that is a really fantastic question. So I think part of the reason why I wanted to kind of dispel the myth that orange wine is always orange is that if you have studied any qualifications with us, you'll know that there are a number of other factors which will affect the appearance of a wine. So that skin contact may impart some colour, but what might also be imparted, what might also provide colour to a wine is, for example, storing it in an oak barrel for a prolonged period of time. Oak barrels are watertight, but they're not airtight. So over time, oxygen can affect the appearance of a wine in the same way that if you bite into an apple and it starts to go brown, oxygen can do that to a white wine. So you may have a white wine that looks a bit orangey or goldy, but that's actually not to do with skin contact. That's to do with, exactly as you say, being placed in an oak barrel for a prolonged period of time, or having some age on it. Labels or producers that I recommend. I mean, I've had a look at some regions here. I would encourage trying the wines that are coming out of Georgia, amber wines, as well as wines from Friuli, Venezia Giulia and Slovenia. I can place a few other more specific suggestions on my Instagram a little bit later, so look out for that. Cold maceration as well as alcoholic fermentation. Yes, so if this process is taking about a year, it's not just necessarily going to be during the process of fermentation that the colour and tannin is extracted. So we might have some maceration taking place pre-fermentation and also potentially post-fermentation as well, because fermentation may not take quite so long as, for example, an entire year. How long is the fermentation with the skin? A question from Jap. Another really good question, and I think that's one of the tricky things about orange wine. It can be anything from about a week up to about a year, but none of that is kind of legislated. None of that is really a rule. So there's no reason to say it couldn't be even longer than that, or potentially even slightly shorter than that. And so really there's quite a wide set of styles you can achieve by making orange wine. And it generally comes down to how long that skin, that grape skin, has been left in contact with the juice. Risks with leaving the skins on during fermentation. Actually, it protects against spoilage a little bit better. It's a question from Elizabeth. So that's partly why orange wine production has been embraced by the natural wine community, because it requires fewer kind of interventions to protect a white wine, for example, against spoilage. So it's quite a robust, or what's the word, it's a way of making wine that isn't quite so risky in terms of spoilage as potentially white wine is. Could we call orange wine macerated white wine? We definitely could. That's a good term for it. I also like skin contact. I like amber. Ramato is kind of a category in and of itself. It is confusing, that word orange, but I can see why it gets used, and I think it does make lots of sense in lots of ways, as long as you kind of caveat it by saying no oranges were used here. But yes, macerated works, skin contact also certainly works. Rosé wines also have an orange colour, so is that also orange wine? Another really good question. So the difference really between rosé wine and orange wine is that rosé wine is made using black grape varieties, and those black grape varieties will just be left, the skins of those black grape varieties will just be left in contact with the juice for a very short amount of time, just imparting a little bit of this kind of pinkish colour. Orange wine, by contrast, needs to be made using white grape varieties, but there are lots of similarities there and certainly can be. Ed Wilson, how do you know when orange wine has gone off? That's an interesting question, because I suppose you've said it's not necessarily that easy to see that the colour has changed or the appearance has changed. I think really you've got to give it a smell and a taste. If it's still smelling kind of vibrant with those aromas of things like spices and fruits, tropical fruits and things like that, then you know you're good. If it's starting to smell a little bit stale, potentially, or a little bit vinegary, then it might be that it's been left open too long or something like that. But really, there's no other way than to smell and taste it. Is orange wine going to be available in India? Gosh, I'm really not sure of that. But what I do know is that it's getting more and more popular, and exports are growing and growing because demand for it, particularly in Europe, is certainly going up. So I imagine demand will be rising around the world too for this style of wine. And last question, I think, from Mo: are there any grapes that are going to give a better taste? So I guess any that are more better suited to the production of orange wine. Another really good question. Aromatic grape varieties are generally considered to be quite a positive thing for the production of orange wine. So look out for those grape varieties that you might use for aromatic white wines. So as I said, Sauvignon Blanc, Gewürztraminer, some good ideas. Ribolla Gialla is really considered the orange wine grape in northeastern Italy, so another good one to check. A few more questions coming through. This is brilliant. Can we serve it with blue cheese? I think that's a great shout, particularly a kind of more intense, maybe slightly more robust style of orange wine definitely would go well with blue cheese. Another question from Clive: can other woods be used for barrels? Yep, they absolutely can. So as with other production of wine, we can certainly use other woods. So acacia wood is being increasingly used for white wine production. I don't see why that wouldn't be a great thing to use for orange wine too. Cherry wood as well. But oak barrels still sort of reign supreme when it comes to those vessels. Just one last note on that is that, yes, we might use wood, but amphora are increasingly used. So these kind of clay vessels, including Qvevri, which we see in Georgia, but all over when it comes to producing orange wine, using clay amphora vessels is also very popular. The usual ABV on orange wines, another question from Ed, a really good question. They tend to be on the slightly lower side, but can be anything. Really, there's no rule of thumb. But as a general rule, most of the orange wines that I've kind of seen and tasted have been on the lower alcohol side, so under 13% ABV, sometimes even under 12. So I can see a little feedback window has opened up on your screen. If you wouldn't mind filling that out, that would be fantastic. The recording of this webinar will be emailed to everybody, so look out for that in your inbox, and it will also sit on the WSET Events Hub on YouTube, so you can catch up whenever you like. If any of this has made you kind of keen to think about studying wine or doing a WSET qualification, then you can visit our Where to Study page on the WSET website and have a look for a provider of courses near you. I'll just put my little thank you slide up and say thank you everybody so much for joining us. I hope you've managed to find some orange wine today to have a taste of it and explore such a fantastic category. Thank you.